Well, that's a long story, but if we have time, we'll tell the whole story.
We have time.
My grandparents, my grandfather was a successful businessman in Los Angeles, and he and his wife, I guess, decided to have a beach place. They were living in Los Angeles and settled out Hermosa, where so many businessmen and people in Los Angeles acquired houses in the early days. I think it was, I never checked the records, but I think it was around 1920 or thereabouts that they bought this cottage in Hermosa and used it as a summer vacation place. That existed all during the 20s, and then a few years after I was born, the Depression was in full swing, and my dad and mother asked her mother, that's my grandmother, who was a widow then, whether or not they could live in the house. And the grandmother said, of course, you can go down there, Lawrence and Ruth, and make your home there, raise little Larry. So it was about 1932 or 3, as far as I recollect. And so I went to North School up the hill, 25th Street, and enjoyed all the wonderful things that Hermosa had to offer for children. Running free and running around the back of the valleys and all that, and making a lot of friends. And that lasted until the war, and my dad got a commission in the Army, and my parents moved to Los Angeles. In the meantime, my grandmother passed away and left the house at 2428 Strand to my mother and dad. And then, as I say, my parents moved to Los Angeles during the war, and I went to Los Angeles High School at that time. And of course, I was always in love with the beach, so I can remember taking the Rossport bus to Venice Street, and then getting on the Venice streetcar, going down to Venice, and then across Manhattan Beach, in front of all the houses. This red car ran along there, and then behind the houses in Hermosa, and got off, and I stopped at our old house and stayed there on weekends and partied with the kids down here, because I made a lot of good friends, of course, growing up, and I was like the girls down here better anyway. So that was that, and then I went off to college and met my late wife, who was there, and we fell in love and so forth. And on one of our early dates, I said, what do you do in the summertime? She said, well, my parents have a house in Hermosa Beach. And so lo and behold, my wife, Katie, had grown up summers down here. She was a summer person, so us locals didn't really know them, but they didn't play with us. But anyway, it was only about 6 blocks from where I had grown up. And as a result, during college, we had a lot of fun coming back in the summers here. And then, of course, when I was married, we got married. We had to live in Hermosa Beach, obviously. So we got a little house up on 28th Street. And we were there for a few years. And I had some service interruption. And then the house next door to my parents' house came up for sale. And the owners were living in San Diego, and they kind of let it go. And it came up at a really good price. I'm not sure what to put that in. But yeah, I think.
No, give the price. That's interesting.
$23,500, and it was next door to my parents. And so my dad and mother said, you kids ought to go for it. And I said, we'll get the money. They said, well, we'll let you have the down payment. So anyway, we made a down payment on the house and moved in there and lived there for a few years, raising, I guess all of our children were born there.
Okay, let's start off with when I started my business. After I got out of the Army in 1960, I went back to school, and I decided to go to school. I went back to El Camino for a couple of years, and then I transferred up to Humboldt State And I didn't graduate. I had almost 4.5 years of college, but my father died and I came back to take care of everything and get him buried. And that was probably about 63. Yeah, 1963 my father died. Anyway, I came back and I decided to take a break from school and ended up down here at the beach because that's where I lived and that's where I grew up. And anyway, I had to get a part-time job, and that was driving an ambulance, which I really enjoyed, by the way. And it was kind of like being a fireman. I worked like 4 days a week, and I had 3 or 4 days a week. Usually worked 3.5 days and had 3.5 days off. And it was a pretty good job. I made good money, and I decided to open up a little small shop on Pacific Coast Highway as kind of a hobby and supplemental income. And I just did old classic cars and hot rods and mainly painting cars. And I rented a place on Pacific Coast Highway, and it's now the mobile gas station. It's right at the corner of Aviation and Pier, Aviation Pacific Coast Highway. And it was an old Chrysler and Mercedes dealership at one time. And Cy Amon, who owned Sunray Auto Parts on the highway, had bought the property, and he opened up a speed shop there. And half of it was a speed shop, and I rented the other half. And I was really there 2 or 3 days off a week, working in my shorts, my shirts off, with my shirt off, getting a good suntan. People would stop by, and we'd work on old antique cars and hot rods. And then people started bringing me their Porsches and their Corvettes because I was working pretty cheap, and I was painting those. And pretty soon the business just took off, and I decided to, oh, and by the way, I was driving an ambulance, and I would actually work on the ambulances during working hours and making sure I got my nice clean white uniform not dirty. And I'd work on the company's ambulances, and it saved them thousands and thousands of dollars by having me do it while I was on duty and not tying it up for a week or so. So that's where I started, down there at Pacific Coast Highway, and it's now a mobile gas station there, and that was a lot of fun. And I was there for 2 years. And then Cy Amon sold the property, and I knew I wanted to stay on the highway, and I found a place here at 2nd Street. It was an old towing place called Goff's Garage, and it was quite miserable when I looked in there. It was for rent, but they had big pits in the floor where they fixed Model Ts at one time. It was actually a Model T dealership in 1922 to about 1927, and it still had the big pits in the ground where the workers, the mechanics would work down in the pits and work on the car. So I had to fill up 5 of those pits and remodel the building. And it took me almost about 8 or 9 months before I really got going again. And that was about 1968. And next door, I paid rent. It was in '68, and next door was a bar called the Four Aces. And originally it was a glass doll from about 1955 up to about '65. And it was kind of a rough bar. A lot of motorcycles hung out there. Anyway, I was able to purchase the property in 1970, and the Four Aces still had 2 or 3 years left on their lease, so that was kind of a problem working in a body shop and I lived behind the bar. There was a house there after I bought the property. There was 2 houses, and I lived in the house, so it was kind of fun working all day and then listening to Harley Davidson's motorcycles at night. But anyway, I was able to get the bar.
Hermosa Beach. My grandfather came here in 1918. And so my grandparents lived here, my parents, myself, my children, my grandchildren, and I have one great-grandson. So that's how long we've lived in Redondo/Hermosa Beach. And he built his house at 1245 First Street in Hermosa Beach. And he had that whole corner from First Street to First Place. And on one side was Prospect. Across the street was Redondo. And then if you went the other way, it was also Redondo. And believe it or not, today I live on Anita, just half a block away from where he lived. And I love it.
That's just wonderful. Can you tell us some more about your parents and about what schools you went to?
Well, I went to, at the time, well, I can remember my grandfather walking me to Burl School because there was no kindergarten in Hermosa. And so consequently, I went to Burl School in the kindergarten. And we used to go across, well, there were no houses. You know, we used to just cross from Anita to Burl Street, and then there was Burl School. And then for first grade, I went to the original Prospect Avenue School, which is still there, a two-room schoolhouse. That's where I went in the first and second grade. And they used to have first grade in one room, and second, it was 2A and 2B. And then the third grade was also in that room. And, you know, you were just divided by a hallway. And it was really nice. And then from there, I went to South School, which no longer exists. We now have condos there. And we had the whole bottom part of that as a playground that landed all the way to where Ardmore is today. And that's where I went in the, I think it was a 4th and 5th grade, 6th grade, and then you came here to Pier Avenue. In 1944, I graduated here. Don't count the years. And then from there, I went to Redondo High School, where everybody went to Redondo High School. But during the war, I did go to Malacco School because my father was contracted to work the harvest that the Japanese had left planted in Palos Verdes Peninsula when they were taken to the concentration camps in 1942. So we lived in Lanada Bay from 1942 February until about August, September, until all that harvest was harvested. And then, you know, because that used to be just harvest land at that time. And so consequently, that's when I went to Malacco School, which I understand now is going to be reopened, that they're refurbishing it, and they're going to reopen what was the original first school in Palos Verdes Peninsula. And then I came back, at that time I was going to St. James, 1 year in St. James, but then I came back to Pier Avenue. Because we lived in my grandfather's house in Hermosa at that time. But my father had already bought a house in Redondo, so we ended up at 617 North Irena, which I still own. And I wouldn't think of selling that property because it's going to stay in the family as long as we can keep it in the family.
No, it's changed so much. Well, this hilltop where we settled was pretty much a hilltop where we're living now.
Right.
And we started on 24th Place, which was on the west side of the railroad tracks. No, excuse me, it was on the east side of the railroad tracks, which is kind of out of town. And so ultimately, we had to move somewhere else. But we bought a 5-unit apartment down to the beach, which was kind of a mistake. But we were a little tired of living on the wrong side of the railroad tracks. And I think other times, too, we wanted to expand our holdings. So we sold the house on 24th and moved to the apartment down there. We occupied 2 of the apartments. We knocked a hole in the wall. And we had 3 more rentals, which was interesting and helpful. But the south, that was on the south end of Hermosa Beach, was mostly occupied by what we now call hippies. And, well, a typical example of what I learned about the town, just before Christmas, I put some colored lights on the handrail around the upstairs ladder and so forth. And before I could turn on the lights had all been stolen. And so that, to me, made me think about when I thought about this part of Hermosa Beach. And it's kind of like, but Beach Drive was then, with my assistant, Beach Drive was blocked. It was an alley. And people used to go 80 miles an hour up the alley for a while. And sometimes there were very exciting moments. And ultimately, we got barricades to put in. And we had locks on them so they could be opened by the fire department and any emergency activities. But anyway, ultimately, then we, after 3 or 4 years, I don't remember exactly, but we moved up here on the hilltop. We've got very good drainage.
I'd like to hear a little something about your family.
You also were beautiful.
My family, my dad was a druggist he was living in Banning and scout sign pitching. He got a scholarship to USC, and so he went to USC, and this was a close community to that after he graduated from pharmacy school, and they rented a house, and they finally bought a house up on 844 Manhattan Avenue in Hermosa Beach, and that's kind of it. And then he opened a drugstore in 1936 down on Pier Avenue, the 58 Pier Avenue in 1936, and then he had that drugstore until 1948, I think it was. 45.
And subsequently, what did you do for a living here in Hermosa Beach?
Well, after I got out of USC, I went to work for my dad as a pharmacist. And the drugstore at that time that he had bought moved back here to on the corner of Pure Avenue and Hermosa. I think there's a Italian restaurant there now. And was there for 10 years, rode my bicycle to work. And then we saved $40,000 and opened a drugstore up on Artesia and Pacific Coast Highway. And then had another drugstore after that, and then built a small chain of drugstores.
What was it like back then? And I want both of you to kind of answer on this one. What was it?
In the early days, it was, I can remember going on a little flexi flyer that I had, that I got for Christmas, and along the Strand with my mom and dad for a walk, and everything was dark. I don't even think there were any lights then. And you'd have, in one block, you'd see a house with a light on it, then all the rest of the houses would be dark. And then maybe two houses in the next block. People just weren't here in the winter time. It was just all the houses were blacked out. They were owned by people from Pasadena and Los Angeles, Beverly Hills. And so anyway, that was a very quiet time. Of course, there were vacant lots all over, sand lots all over the Strand. And downtown Hermosa had sand lots in it. You know, there weren't stores next to each other all the way down like it is now.
How has Hermosa changed in your time here?
Well, the density has increased, but the biggest change in my mind is the beach. Because when I was a little kid, I remember that the water used to come up over the Strand, wash all the way down to Hermosa Beach, and pretty good sized rocks were washed with it, and it was so close that it was amazing. And now, since that Hyperion project, where they hydraulic slush mined all that sand in the Hyperion, we've got I don't know what the beach is, probably 600-700 feet deep, compared to probably 75 feet when I was a kid.
What do you like?
Well, I moved here in 1948 after I got out of University of California at Berkeley because I had a job. I got a job at Northrop Aircraft and wanted to live at the beach. And again, even at that time, the beach was pretty much summer residences. There were people who lived here all the time, but not as many as now, where it's almost everyone lives here all the time. The pier had been condemned because the original pier was being destroyed by the ocean. However, my friends, the Sea Wrights, knew Jimmy Bailey, who was one of the lifeguards, and in October of 1949, Jimmy allowed us to open the gate and go out to the end of the pier with the rubber canvas covered surf mats that Jimmy Bailey that the Sea Wrights had loaned to us, and Don and I had just met a week or so before, and we threw the surf mats off the end of the pier and jumped in and rode the big waves in, and we did that 4 or 5 times. Unfortunately, the first time I jumped off, I was used to holding my nose if I jumped off anything that high, and I jammed my thumb in my eye and had a black eye, so that didn't look too well with the new date.
I first visited Hermosa Beach back in 1937 when I was a guest of a family who was down here for a week for Easter vacation. And back in those days in South Hermosa Beach there, I remember the boardwalk. And that was quite an event from the little house they were running down near the beach there to get out on the ocean and go across the boardwalk. I could see it, picture it today right in my mind. It was just very clearly. And that's how it was back in those days, and of course you know it's changed now. Our family moved to the South Bay in 1940. My dad was chief zone engineer of the WPA back during the Depression days, and the zone included all the South Bay, Long Beach, LA, Pasadena, all the Rose Bowl and all those things. He did work in all those different projects. Also did work in Manhattan Beach. So during as that project was winding down, the city of Charlie Black, who was the mayor at the time in Manhattan, offered Dad the job of city engineer. They never had one. So he was the city engineer for City of Manhattan Beach, and then the family moved on down, and we lived right off the beach on 8th Street in Manhattan. And from there, did my 4 years of high school and all that activities. And one of the things, of course, during high school is when World War II started. And that had a lot of effect on the whole dynamics of everything that was going on with everybody. And that includes the thousands of people that came out west from the Midwest or from the East Coast and had a touch of the beach life. And that made a big impact, especially after World War II. Everybody knows that. And then we ended up with most of the classmates we had all decided to join up different services because there were opportunities for high school people to join a reserve organization, and I ended up joining the Marine Corps Reserve and went into all the basic training, and then there were quite a few of us from our class were in the Navy. A lot of them were in the Navy. Few went in the Air Corps. It wasn't the Air Force yet, but it was the Air Corps. And then some even went into the Coast Guard and did their war service through the Coast Guard. So anyhow, I ended up.
We first came to this house, or not this house, but we used to rent a house in the summer for a few months, and we were renting the house across the walk one year, and my husband heard that this was for sale, so we put a bid on it, and we got the house, and that was about 1952.
Do you recall what a house on the Strand went for back in those days?
I can tell you what this one went for. $23,000.
$23,000 for this beautiful home on the Strand. Wow.
My husband had a friend who, this was before we were married, had a friend whose mother had a house down here. And he used to come down and spend some time with them in the summer. So when we got married, we were married in February, and when summer came, he said, go down and rent a house in Hermosa. And I said, well, how do you rent a house? Coming from Phoenix, Arizona, I had no idea what. So we did get a house, and we rented do you remember the Adams family? Nancy and Bob? We rented that house that year. And it was like, maybe $250, $300 a month. But if you took it for 4 months, you could have it for like $250 or something crazy, you know. But that's what we did. And then for about 3 or 4 years, well, during the war we didn't come down. But other than that, we came down and rented various houses. And we rented across the street, the English house one time. And we found out this was for sale. And so my husband had his good friend who was in the real estate agent look it up, and it was in probate. So I don't know how probate works, but when they open it up or whatever, we were the only people that had bid on the house. And all my friends said, well, we wanted that house, but there wasn't a sign on it, so nobody bothered with it, so here we are.